Hey everyone, welcome back to a special episode of LionWing Talks. I'm your host, Bradley Hailstorm. I just happen to also be the founder and president of LionWing. And today we are bringing you, as mentioned, a special episode of LionWing Talks where I'm going to be sitting down with the graphic designer on the English version of Embryo Machine. And he and I are going to walk through what the localization process was like on Embryo Machine. We'll be talking about specifics as it pertains to Embryo Machine, but we will also sort of inevitably digress into just the localization process in general, and not necessarily related to Embryo Machine. Or let me be more clear. I will digress, as I naturally do, about other things that are not directly related to Embryo Machine. Tyler is more focused than I am. So hopefully his focused aim will help keep me a little bit on track tonight. But nevertheless, I hope this is going to be a fun conversation. I mean, we're not going to cover every single aspect of the localization of Embryo Machine just because that would probably bore you to tears. Certainly, there are some of you out there who want to hear every single detail like that, but that will not necessarily be this show. Over time, I'm sure some of those details will come out as we continue to do LionWing Talks episodes and people ask questions and all of that. But tonight, we're going to be doing sort of a higher view of what the process was like. But nevertheless, we will be getting into some of the nitty gritty stuff, which I think will be fun. But uh, let me first introduce, I shouldn't say first because I just talked for like a minute straight, so it's not first anymore. Secondly, let me introduce my co host tonight, the man of the hour, the one who has made, in many ways, the Embryo Machine English version. Possible because without a graphic designer, there is no English version. Tyler, thanks so much for joining us tonight and for being willing to talk about this process and what it was like.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So, sorry, I thought you were going to say more, so I was grabbing a drink of Gatorade right quick. But you got in and out real quick right there. So we've got off to a great start. So we've got we've got an outline that we're going to attempt to follow tonight with some of the bigger highlights of I think that the fun stuff behind the localization process. But we'll probably veer off this a little bit. So without any further ado, let's just jump right into it. Hey, if you're joining us live on Twitch, thank you so much. Feel free to ask us questions as we go along. Sort of invariably, we'll be covering something, but then won't get into the exact angle that perhaps you want to hear about. And I mean, that's the benefit of being live, is you can just drop us a question in the chat and we will get to you. So feel free to do that, or feel free to comment however you want to engage. We definitely welcome engagement. Last night's show, there was a lot of conversation happening as the show was going on, which was fantastic. I don't know if as many people will show up for it tonight because, again, I think they're probably like, all right, I saw enough of Bradley last night for 90 minutes. I don't need to see or hear from him again tonight. But nevertheless, if you are on the line, yeah, don't hesitate to speak up. So now, without any further ado, let's first talk about one of the first things that you look at when you are digging into a new localization process. This might bore folks a little bit if you were here for the chat last night, and that is the name. There are various localization properties that keep its original Japanese name, or really the name of whatever language the work was originally published in. But then there are, of course, plenty of projects that change the name. I mentioned in the last episode of LionWing Talks that I really tried to respect the creator's vision, and oftentimes respecting the creator's vision means respecting their name choice, especially in the case of Embryo Machine, where the game was marketed as Embryo Machine in Japan. I mean, the the logo on the front of the box of the Japanese version is Embryo Machine spelled out in English. So it was a very conscious choice they made, and I chose to respect that. Some people they haven't loved the name. Some people have definitely loved the name. I've found that you very so far I haven't really found anyone who's like, oh yeah, it's an okay name. Like for whatever reason, this name tends to be very polarizing, which to be honest, I kind of love. I like when there's a strong reaction to a product because I mean, I think that's good for the product to bring awareness to it. From my observations and from the people that I've talked to, they either absolutely love the name and think like that is the most badass name ever, and other people are like, that is the worst name I have ever heard. Why didn't you change that thing? But I just told you I didn't change it, and because I personally liked it. So I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to change something that I really like, that I feel really strongly about. Um, and yeah, keeping the name was a great talking point. We had a lot of people engaging about the game early on just because of the name, which was cool. I liked that. Tyler, I don't think I've ever asked you, how do you feel about the name?
Oh, I totally love it as well, and I agree. It's gotten a lot of mixed reactions from the people I've told about as well. I think it just kind of it elicits a lot of different kind of imagery, and so it's yeah, it's great. It's a great conversation starter. It's everybody seems interested and engaged, so I think it's pretty cool. It's unique.
It definitely is unique. Yeah, I was telling the story last night that there have been so many games like Kickstarter projects that have popped up in my Facebook feed, and and I see them and then I move on with my scrolling, and then like the next day I'm like, oh, that one game looked really cool. I can't remember what the name of that game was. And then I either have to go into my ad settings, like buried in the ad setting is this page that you can pull up of all the ads you've seen. Then I've got to like go through all the ads that I've scrolled past. I'm like, oh yeah, that's the one. Or I'm like, you know what? That's too much work. I guess I didn't really need that game in my life in the first place. And then that game never gets my support. With Embryo Machine, I'm not
Right.
sure you forget that name, because it is such a unique name that it's like, oh yeah, I saw that one game. It had the weirdest name ever, but hey, you remembered it and you're talking about it, or you're talking with your friend. You're like, hey, did you see that game on Kickstarter, Embryo Machine? What a name, right? And hey, that's not such a bad thing for a company that's pretty new like LionWing, as a way to sort of build brand awareness. A good name, or at least a name that gets people talking, isn't the worst thing in the world. So that's why we chose to keep the name Embryo Machine. Someone did ask me at some point, um, did you ever consider, and I can't remember who asked me this, but nevertheless, did you ever consider another name for the game? And I hadn't considered another name for the game until that question came up. And I hadn't considered another name for the game because
Mhm.
I liked the name so much. It's I oftentimes give this example, but it's like when I go to the store and I have to pick out a birthday card, and I always pick the first one that makes me laugh. I don't look like the other 150 cards that there are. I just go with the first one that made an impression on me. And so Embryo Machine and its name was the very same way, that I never thought about another name because I didn't need to, because I loved the original, right off the bat. Now, after that person asked me,
Yeah.
did you have any other names that you would consider? I said no, but now that you mention it, I want to think on that. And so I think if someone was like, you have to change the name of the game right now, gun to my head, I've got to make a change. I think I would try to maintain the essence and the spirit of the original name, while also modifying it so that it was, I don't know, less bold, which again, like, where's the fun in that? But this is just for the example. I would probably go with something like the Embryo Wars, um, something
Cool.
that kind of got at the heart of what the game is, which it's a war game. I would be able to keep the embryo name in there because the embryo machines are. I mean, I wouldn't change the names of the mechs in the games. They're called embryo machines. I would never do that. And there's a storyline reason
Right.
for why they're called that. So I would probably want to keep part of the title in it. And I think Embryo Wars sounds way better than like the Machine Wars. Um, so so that would be, I guess, if I had to change the name, and I never would, that would be what I would change it to. Um,
It's a good one. Yeah.
yeah, it's not bad.
Did Bradley
Go ahead.
do oh sorry, yeah, sorry. Do this is a pretty popular game though in Japan as well right now, correct? Like I actually kind of think it's cool that we maintained the name and have just kind of brought it over
Yeah,
to the
so
West.
absolutely. So not only is the game popular in Japan, and perhaps some people would say, well, that doesn't matter. You're not releasing the game in Japan. This is an English version. You're releasing it for
Right.
the West in North America. And I would say, well, okay, yes, that's obvious. But um, a lot of people in the West already know of this game. So there are people not in Japan who know of Embryo Machine and or have played it or even own the
Mm.
Japanese version. And so to go from a game that has such a bold name that people already know about to then change it, I just think feels weird. It's like this weird shift that feels
Exactly.
unnecessary. And it's like then you have to start thinking about, well, why would we change the name? Would we change the name so that like it didn't put off as many people? I don't know. I don't know if I've ever not enjoyed some kind of media because the name was weird. I mean, I can't tell you how many anime I've watched where I'm like, that's a terrible title. I would like if I was the localization manager on that project, I would have changed that. But I'm never like, well, I'm not watching that anymore because that's a terrible title. But we saw that. I actually saw that in the Facebook comments. Not a lot, but especially when the ads first started going up, I saw people say like, I wanted to play this game, but I can't get past that name. And I'm like, that's a I mean, I'm not going to tell you, how to engage with whatever media you like, but like that's a bad way to
Yeah.
engage with media that you like. Like that's just is like blasphemy. Like you wouldn't watch a movie because it's a bad title. Well, okay, well then I guess you're not watching half the movies ever made.
That's yeah, it's a lot of movies.
That's a lot of
Most.
movies. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, I think most movies, yeah, most can be kind of warranted as being kind of weird or dumb.
yeah.
You really get down to it.
Yeah. Die Hard 2, Die Harder. Um, you know, I don't know about that one,
Yeah,
but I love that movie. I love me some Colonel Stewart. Um, but it's a bad
indeed.
name.
Yeah.
So so they're titles of games it's complicated. It's really complicated. Sometimes it's very clear, like you just got to change the name, and other times it's not as clear. And for me anyway, it was very clear that we're just not changing this. There's no need to. So
Yeah.
let's talk about some other changes specifically to names, and this time let's talk about mech name changes. So in Embryo Machine, there are 9 Embryo Machines. And in Japanese, the names of the EMs are are pretty charismatic. They are pretty grand. Most EMs have like 2 names, like almost like a first name and a last name, which I always thought was interesting. Um,
Yeah.
and so Tyler, do you remember I came to you at some point, and it was the first time that I was thinking about changing the mech names, and I was like, "Hey, what do you think of these mech names?" And you were like, "I don't remember exactly what you said, but you're like, they're kind of weird." What did you think about the mech names
Yeah.
when you first saw them?
I mean, I was trying to find just like I mean, they were very unique for one. And I was trying to find I feel like usually with names of things you can go, oh, like they clearly were inspired by like Viking lore or like these are clearly have some sort of like Greek influence or even like Japanese influence. But these I was like, these just seem like they're almost like pretty random almost or I wondered about like the characters backstories or if there was kind of lore that went into it that make some sense to the names because they just seemed almost like a randomized like just pretty random to me but that was just my initial take on them.
Yeah, when I first got the translations, and even before that, when I was just looking over the Japanese assets, because all of the EM names are in katakana, so it's pretty easy to figure out what they are. I remember thinking like these just feel like random names put together, and I'm sure that there was thought that went into it clearly. But when you look at, I mean, this is part of the localization balancing act. It's like, how do you think your new audience is going to respond to the localized text? And I was afraid that the new audience wasn't going to care if there was a backstory to these names. They were just going to see the names like they did with the game name and say, oh, that's strange. Or that reads weird. Or that's bad. And they wouldn't have the desire to further explore why that name was the way that it was. They would just chalk it up as that's a really strange name. And I didn't want that because unlike Embryo Machine, the game name, where like, yes, it's unique and kind of weird, but there's a boldness to it that just like pulls you in. These names didn't have that, not to me. And so that is part of the fun of localization is figuring out, all right, where do I pick my spots? Where do I jump in and do my thing and add some new flavor for the new audience to ensure that the new audience reads it in a way that feels natural to them? And then where are the aspects where you say, all right, I really want to maintain almost like a transliteration here, um, of keeping it as close to the source material as possible. And so it's localization's fun because it doesn't get boring because you're constantly having to weigh those two decisions right there. Where do I take some creative liberties so that it resonates in the way that it needs to resonate with the new audience? And then where do I pull back and allow the original translation to sort of shine and do its thing? You know, a name in one language doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate well, figuratively translate well, or literally in this case, to a new audience. So you have to always sort of gauge where your audience is. And unlike again the game name, these names were just um, they read awkwardly. So here's a couple that we had. That we are working with and that we ultimately changed. We didn't make like huge changes. We really kept the essence of what these names were, of what these EM names were, but we just made some small tweaks. And sometimes in localization, you really want to kind of like open up the creative lanes and sometimes you rewrite entire bits of text, you know what I mean? Other times you just make some corrections here and there. And this is one of those situations where underneath kind of the strangeness of the names, there was something there. And so we really tried to maintain that, preserve it. So here's what we got. So there is in the game there is there's an extra large mech who we call Visner, Visner. Do you have that mech board actually by any chance, Tyler? Pulled up?
I do.
Could you
Give me
share your
one
screen
sec.
there?
Yes. Oh, this is the here we go. One sec.
Hey, nothing says good audio like dead air, right?
Um, Scroll to record 10. Okay, this should work. Apologies,
No, no, you're
apologies.
fine. I'm just talking to fill the
All
void
right.
now. All right,
All
there we
right.
go. Sorry, I've got my screen set up a little differently tonight. So if I'm looking off to the right, that's because I've got my OBS running on this screen instead of this one directly ahead of me. So yeah, so this is Visner, as you see up here in the top right corner. There we've got Visner. So his original name, though, was Wisner Glome or Wisner Glome. Wisner space capital Glome. So that name to me did not scream, I'm a mech. That name to me screamed, I'm this dude. Um, I'm just this guy. And I'm this guy with kind of a strange name, but I'm a guy. And that's that. Or I'm a person, it didn't say I'm a mech. And so I wanted to maintain the essence of that name. I also knew that because almost all of the mechs had at least two words for a name, I wanted to cut those down to one word names for the English version, just to make it easier on folks to remember the name. And I just felt that we're talking about mechs here. I don't think mechs need a first and a last name, or in some cases, sort of like an entire sentence for a name, like Lumiere de Orage, which we'll talk about here in a second. And so, I thought about just the shows that I watch and the names of those mechs. And certainly every mech show or every mech game handles these types of things differently. And some mechs have super long names and all of that. But by and large, I thought I want single word names. So I took Wisner Gloam and I cut it down to Visner. I initially took off Gloam and said Wisner. I don't like. I don't like how that sounds. I don't like the way that's pronounced. I don't like the wh at the, and at the beginning, it wasn't strong enough for me. And especially for this mech, as you see on the screen here, this is a hulking mech. I mean, look at the size double L. He's the only mech in the game who's a size double L. So I needed something strong for this guy. So I said, you know what? I was thinking about the German language, and I was like, in German they would pronounce Wissner as Wissner. So we're actually just going to phonetically make this Vissner. We're gonna drop the W and we're gonna just put a V in the place of it. And as soon as I did that, as soon as I saw it on my text sheet, I said, okay, that's it. I don't even need to think about this any further. And I literally went on to the next one. I felt that confident in Vissner being this guy's name. And so sometimes that's how the localization process happens. Sometimes that's how you get the name of something. It sometimes it's not more complicated than that. And I really like Vissner. I think it makes sense for this particular mech. So let's talk about Zimmer. Um, Tyler, can you pull up Zimmer for us? So Zimmer is one
Yes.
one of the smaller mechs in the game, but Zimmer also had sort of a two-word name. So he was Zimmer Bolia, and I thought again, like that sounds like a person. Um, and we're talking about death dealing badass hawking mechs here. Like I don't want the mech to sound like a person. Um, and it wasn't just the fact that it was a two-word name that was throwing me off there, but it was those two words together. It sounded like, oh, that just sounds like someone that I would meet, um, you know, walking past them, like, oh, hey, Zimmerbolia, like, how's it going? And so I didn't want that. Again, I wanted this to feel like a mech, and as we see here on the screen, there's Zimmer. So this one was even easier than Vissner, where I did no additional work other than I chopped off the last name, so to speak. Bolia out. He's just Zimmer. Um, and this made a lot of sense because when I look at this mech right now, that doesn't look like a Zimmer Bolia. But if you say, does it look like a Zimmer though? I say absolutely. That's a Zimmer. Just like Vissner was a Vissner, this was a Zimmer. Uh, what did you think of this, Tyler?
Yeah, I really like this name as well. I think it's I feel like we kind of just took focus on the best parts of the names and kind of reduced them down to like almost like even like the nicknames of their full names at times, which I thought was a great way to do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly, that was, that's kind of what was going through my mind in this of like,
Hmm.
okay, let's say we did keep the multiple word names for all the mechs. No one's going to call them by that entire name. No one's gonna say like, I'm gonna choose Zimmerbolia, or like, hey, what do you think about Zimmerbolia's evade value? Like, is it too low or too high? You know what I
Right.
mean? People would just say, what do you think about Zimmer's evade? Yeah, that. So to
Totally.
me, it was like, let's just drop the part that no one's going to pronounce anyway, and I think that last part gets in the way of of this mech being a mech. So let's.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I found myself when I was looking at the original names, like I got so caught up in wondering if I was pronouncing it properly that I kind of stopped enjoying like consuming that like the new material and checking out the mech. I got almost like fixated on the name.
Absolutely. So, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you brought that up because that is like the beauty of localization. You should so when you're consuming some sort of localized media, you should never know that you're consuming localized media. This should feel like
Right.
media that was created in your language. And there are no clues that it was created elsewhere and then translated and then edited and then proofed and QA'd and sent back to be edited again to be proofed and QA'd again. If you pick up on that, and even if you're not having the thought of like, oh, this is a localized, product, but if you do exactly what you just talked about, Tyler, of I'm getting tripped up on this name, like I don't know how to pronounce this. Okay, then because this is a localized product, you did to me for LionWing. If that happens, I think, all right, we did not do our job. If you're getting tripped up on the name, we did something wrong because you shouldn't get tripped up on the name. Yeah, because it's like with Wissner Gloam, like do you, is it supposed to be sort of German sounding? And is the W in Wisner actually pronounced like a V? Do you pronounce the last name as Glome, or do you pronounce it as Glome? Do you leave off the E entirely, and is it Glom? I mean, so I wanted to
Hmm.
eliminate that entirely because nothing will pull you out of an experience faster than having to stop and reread a word and reread a word and reread a word and think, I don't know if I'm even getting that. And I just reread this thing 5 times. What am I even reading at this point? Suddenly you've broken your immersion and you're not playing the game anymore. You're analyzing the game. And that to me is a
Yes,
bad game then. Not a bad game, but a bad localization or a bad editing job. So yeah,
totally. Yeah.
really good to bring up that point. Um, let's bring up Hystrix. Hystrix is
Okay.
kind of fun. The story there behind Hystrix. So Hystrix, we've shown off Hystrix several times in our updates. He's that giant turret of a embryo machine. Um, Not necessarily the on paper the largest mech, because again, Vister is the only double L mech in the game, and Hystrix is a 1L sized mech in the game, but he is the heaviest armor class. And if you just look at him, he looks like the heaviest mech in the freaking game. Like if you put this dude on a scale with any of the others, you're like, oh yeah, this dude would weigh way more. So all right, so
Totally.
this name originally was translated as Historics, as Historix, Historics. And to me, when I first read that, I read it as, oh, Historics, 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 Historical, Historic, History. Now I'm just thinking about history. I'm not thinking about a mech game anymore. So I went from not knowing how to pronounce it to thinking I knew how to pronounce it to be completely sidetracked by a word that was within this word, history, and then not thinking about my mech game any longer. You know,
Yeah.
and so
Me too.
right, okay, yeah. So you had the same exact experience here. So this was one of those situations where I really liked when I sat down and said, okay, how what are we going to do with this name? I really liked as I started saying the name Hystrix, just kind of like quickly pronouncing it. And then, looking at the original Japanese lettering and figuring out from the katakana how it would actually be sounded out. It would not be sounded out as Historics. It would be sounded out as Hystrix. So it was like, wait a second, let's just spell it like Hystrix. And then it was, oh shit, how do we spell Hystrix? Like that, you could spell that name so many ways. So now it was, okay, how do we spell the name so that it's easy to read? Getting back to that. But then also, like, how do we make sure we don't run into it looking like history again? And then also, how do we make the name look cool? Like to me, Zimmer looks cool. It's got a Z in it, so automatically it's a cool word, right? Visner is cool because like well, it's got a V in it, so it's automatically a cool thing. So I looked back at those previous mechs and kind of pulled what I thought was really interesting from from those names. Again, those being those letters Z and V, and thought, all right, well, let me look at the rest of the end of the alphabet. And that's when it was, hold on a second, we can spell Hystrix with a Y and an X in here. Um, let's figure out where I want to place those things. I mean, I knew the X was going to come at the end, but it's like, where do I put the Y? At first, I think I actually had it swapped with the I at the beginning after the H and the Y before the X at the end. But I kind of got back to that same, like, it looks like history again. So then it was the real easy fix of, wait, let's just swap them. Oh, yeah, the Y goes there, the I goes at the end. Now it doesn't look like history at all anymore. Now we look like a very different word. Now I'm not thinking about history when I read this. Instead, all I see is Hystrix. Um, what did you think of this name?
I agree. Like the history, it looks more. I feel like it ties in and relates better to the other names as well. Like it feels more grounded in like kind of the EM universe that we've been kind of building on the Western side. I suppose if that makes any sense.
No, it does make sense. I think it plays into the game's lore really well. Like Hystrix, this looks
Hmm.
like a mech and it's spelled like a mech that would exist within Velm, that would exist within the world of
Yes.
Embryo Machine. Just like Zimmer looks like it belongs, Visner looks like it belongs, Hystrix also follows suit and looks like it
Yes.
belongs. So yeah, really good point.
Yes.
I mean, that's a big
Totally
part
agree.
of localization too, is like, how do you maintain the vibe and the aura of the original game while also making sure you're
Yes.
checking all those other boxes, like, okay, this reads well, it sounds well, it's not going to confuse people, it's not going to take people out of the game, et cetera, et cetera. Lots
Yeah.
to go into these decisions. On the surface, you're like, well, you're just changing names. That's pretty easy, right? You just like come up with the one that looks or reads or sounds the best. But there's a lot more decision making to it. Although sometimes you do see something and you kind of do make kind of a knee jerk reaction of like, no, I want it to be this and I just want it to be that. And there's not a lot of thought that goes into it. You can only get away with doing that so many times in localization before people start to pick up on that. Sin Theory here has a question for us in the chat. Not to break up the conversation, I think you said your favorite mech was Fornice. What is Tyler's favorite? Tyler, do you have a favorite mech in the game?
Ooh, that is a very good question. Yeah, is it all right if I pull it up?
Yes.
Give me 1 second here.
Oh, how your screen disappeared there when you like clicked out of it. You've got like this cool whooshing
Ooh,
effect that's stuck on your screen right now, your share
well,
screen. That's fancy. Now it's just you.
that's fun. Did I fix it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Give me 1 second while I.
It's weird having my main monitor over to the right. I don't like it. I like being able to look directly ahead the whole time.
Here we go.
Ah,
Um,
I didn't know you also liked Fornice.
yes. I don't know, like something about the size and like the speed really sounds appealing to me. And I just really love that design of how like the head and the shoulders look.
Yeah, so I think I did. You know what? I never asked. Um, I never asked the Cosaic team this though. I should totally ask them just for like my own peace of mind. I wonder what mechs Japanese players didn't necessarily play the most but liked the most, because some of the mechs in the game I really love their design, but I don't love playing because it doesn't fit my style. Now Fornice sort of sounds like you like Fornice for the same reason as I like the design of Fornice, like the physical design of Fornice, but I love the play style of Fornice. I love that assassin character.
Hmm.
um, you
Is it all right
know
if I show it one more?
yeah, go for it.
Because there is another one that you made a really good point about the like I'm curious about the play style, and so this is the one where I'm probably the most curious about how it will play.
Yeah, so Tyler was not on our playtesting team. So he worked with
Right.
inserting and all the new text, rearranging the layouts, and all of that. He's been strictly on the graphic design side, but he has not spent much time with the actual game itself. He's been too busy making sure we can all enjoy it in the way that we have so far. Yes.
Indeed.
Okay. So Tordahan. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Really
our
cool. Like those huge blade wings. Yeah.
yeah, I was just about to ask. What do you like most? I assumed it was the giant arm blades.
Yeah. I mean, just it's such a cool looking. It just looks really fierce and imposing.
Well, and there's nothing else like it in the game.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so wide. I just yeah, I find it really fascinating.
Yeah, what's fascinating. So it's a light armor class and only medium size, but like its illustration takes up 3/4 of the damn board. I mean, it's massive. The thing is huge.
Yeah.
So what's funny about Tordahan is um, I so I love all of the mechs in the game. Their visual designs. I think they're, of course I'm going to sound biased here, but I think they're flawless. I don't think like mech art gets any better than what you're seeing on your screen right now. That being said,
Yeah.
even if you love something, and even if you love like the entirety of something, you're always going to have the thing you like the most, and then you're going to have the one you like the least. And so actually for me, so Tordahan is my least favorite mech in terms of its
Mm.
visual design. I think its visual design is fantastic. Again, like having to me having being the worst designed mech in a game like Embryo Machine means your design is better than 90% of the other mech properties out there. So let me just say that. So really, being the least favorite in Embryo Machine of anything means you're probably the best of everything else that comes before it. But yeah, there's something about the design. I think that it looks the whole time I see Tortahan and I think, wow, how does he stay upright? That looks really heavy. Those blades look really,
I
really heavy.
I agree. Whenever I see him, I feel like he should be flying. Like I feel like those are wings.
Yeah, well, he's got the vernier thrusters down there, which means he can hover
It's
over an
true.
elevation without taking any sort of movement penalty. So clearly, someone was thinking that this dude should have at least some sort of flight capabilities. I mean, the thrusters give you sort of a more of a heightened hover kind of effect. You're not flying necessarily. I mean, I guess
True.
you are, but it's a very low level flying. So, but clearly, someone thought that he needed a little extra help. And it's probably because of how giant those. I call them wings. I just refer to them as wings. They're more like blade arms, but
Yeah.
they kind of look like giant vulture wings.
I totally agree, but I feel like you'd just be such an imposing force flying down at you with those Renner thrusters.
Oh, for sure. I mean, can you imagine being on the opposite side of the battlefield as this dude? I mean,
Oh,
that's
yeah,
I don't want to be on the opposite side of this guy flying at me with blade wings. He has blade wings.
totally agree. Yeah, I mean, from the graphic design aspect, he definitely stood out, or it stood out the most because it was kind of the more challenging of all of them to design for because it's so wide with a lot of the graphics we used.
Yeah,
But
for
very
sure.
yeah,
I mean, fortunately, those mech boards, you do get that nice landscape shot, and so it can accommodate for
yeah,
a mech this size. And I'm sure that's part of when they were illustrating and coming up with the concept for Tortahan. I'm sure they were like, let's just go crazy because we've got all this real estate on the boards to work with. And then
true.
the illustrator was
Yeah,
like, all right, hold on, give me like an hour. I got an idea. And came back and was like, what do you think about a bird mech? But the bird's wings are blades. And I can just imagine the team being like, all right, we've got our mech, don't
yeah,
we? That took 1 hour. Thank you. Um, so I would love to have been a fly on the wall in that team meeting where they decided on this particular design. Sin in the chat said, "I'm a
absolutely.
big sucker for color schemes, and I think Fornice and Orage are my favorite based on that. I love Orage's color scheme. The gray, the
Hmm.
black, the purple. Oh, it's just beautiful. It's just beautiful. I agree.
Totally
In fact,
agree.
I think all the color schemes. I mean, the use of color in Embryo Machine is crazy, right?
Yeah, I agree. Like there really isn't a single mech that I'm like, oh, I do not like this one. Like they're all very cool and unique in their own ways, and I love the variety of the color schemes is awesome.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, being like the quote unquote worst design mech, there is no bad design, but being the worst design mech in Embryo Machine is like, oh, you're gonna make me listen to the worst Beatles song? Okay, like, all right, it's better than most songs, but like not my favorite of theirs. So I think it's very similar to that kind of thing. Um,
Totally agree. Yeah.
Sin also said, I do agree the designs themselves are amazing, but I would love to see them in alternate color schemes. Yeah, I do think it would be cool to at some point see what some of these folks would look like with different with a palette swap. I would love to see an all black and gray Fornice. Like how badass would that be, dude?
That would be really cool.
Just because he's an assassin, he moves so quickly. Like it seems so perfect to just totally black out his entire hull, his entire armor. I think that would look so cool.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about two more mechs where we changed their names. Um, Speaking of Arage, he's next on my list. So uh, Orage probably had the most extravagant name in the Japanese version, and for a moment, I thought we're definitely keeping that name. It's so over the top that we can't not keep it. But then I'll tell you why I ultimately chose not to keep it as it was, and instead went with just Orage. So as you see there on the screen, we've got our board of Orage. Um, his original name in the Japanese version was Lumiere de Orage. Now, spelled out on the mech board, actually Lumiere de Orage to me looked really rad. Um, there was just something about the day that just did it for me. Like it just tied together these two seemingly disparate forces that were the first and the last name of this mech, and the day just kind of like made it all make sense. Um, and just seeing those words put together in that order, I thought, wow, that's really unique. Like, that's a lot of name, but that's pretty unique. Maybe we just stick with it because it is so bold. I was kind of thinking about the Embryo Machine name itself. Like, this is one of those opportunities where the name of this mech is so bold that I almost feel bad changing it. What did you think about that? About the original name, Tyler? Lumiere de Arage.
It was probably one of my favorites just because it was so long. But I do like how you did reduce it down to just like the array part, which I just think it fits way better. It felt almost, I don't know why, but it felt very European to me, like the original name, which
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but
it
it was
it
just my like where my mind went with it.
It no, it totally makes sense because mine did too. So I immediately thought, oh, that sounds French. Um,
Yes, yeah.
so which I was cool with. Like I liked that. The one thing that
Hmm.
I guess I didn't like about that, with it sounding so overtly French, is I was like, well, France doesn't exist in this world. You know what I mean? Like that, there is no
Yes.
such thing in Velm as France. So I didn't, in localization. Sometimes when when your story exists in the world separate from ours, it's not always a great idea to bring in the names of cities or even words that we use in our world, because there's too much of a link of, wait a second, we use that on planet Earth, why would they also use this on this world, in some other corner of the galaxy? Like, what are the odds of that happening? Well, the odds are almost impossible. And so it takes someone out of the moment, or at least it can take me out of the moment. I oftentimes credit
Exactly.
Working Designs as being my favorite localization company to ever exist. They are the reason why I'm in localization. They're the reason why I own my own company. They're the reason why I love Japanese games. But Working Designs were the worst at bringing pop culture into their games. So you would be playing something like Albert Odyssey or Lunar, and it's this game that exists in this magical world of dragons, and they're making a joke about Bill Clinton. And it's like, wait a second. Like, I get it. Sometimes you just like, you see a joke and you can't help yourself. And clearly there were many times where Working Designs just could not help themselves. They were like the kid that you leave in a room alone with a candy bar, and you say, I'm going to leave the room. Whatever you do, don't eat that candy bar. I'll be back in 5 minutes. And then the kid, because they're a kid, can't help themselves and they just devour the candy bar. That was sometimes Working Designs. They just could not help themselves with working in cheeky pop culture references. But as the player, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's funny. And then I'm like, wait a second, am I supposed to be thinking about my world or the world of Lunar right now? Because I'm confused, because I just did both. And the minute that happens, you suddenly have just pulled your player out of the game and they're not as invested as they were. And then the next thing you know, which often happened to me, is I'm like, I'm gonna go play something else right now. Let me get to my save point. And it was all predicated upon the fact that I just read a Bill Clinton joke in my high fantasy game. Um, and so Lumiere de Arage was sort of operated on the same principle, where I was like, all right, I'm thinking of France, and more specifically, so this is ultimately why I chose to change it. It wasn't the fact. It wasn't only the fact that it reminded me of France, but I heard Lumiere, and I thought of Beauty and the Beast, and the
Oh
talking
yeah.
candle, um, and I thought, wait a second, I'm looking at this amazing piece of art with all of these stats, and I'm in this world. I'm in Velm right now, and I just thought about a talking candle from a Disney movie. All right, that was it. That was like the moment where I was like, all right, name's got to go. Done. We're changing it right now. Because again, like I said, I was on the fence. I liked the name. I loved how it looked. I loved how long it was, like you said, Tyler. And the minute that I thought
Hmm.
about Beauty and the Beast, I was like, all right. So that was the sign that the universe needed to give me in that moment to say it's time to change that name. And so that's when I thought, all right, I'm not going to like give them a brand new name. Again, I want to keep the essence of the designer's wishes and how they saw these mechs. And so I just lopped off the Lumiere Day, and now we've got Orage. I did toy around with for a moment, and then ultimately said, well, "Hold on a second. That's the exact same reason why I changed the name in the first place." I did mess around with just calling him Lumiere, and I was like, "That no, I can't do that. He can't be Lumiere." So instead, he became Orage.
I feel like his original name stood out. Oh, excuse me.
No, go ahead.
Stood out the most as it felt the most kind of estranged from the other names. It really stood out to me because it felt different from the rest of them. So I do like how Orig definitely feels more consistent with the rest of the universe as well, much like Zimmer and the other names that we did end up with.
For sure. Yeah. No, I totally
Yeah.
agree. It even with the two-word names of most of the other mechs as they were originally translated and intended, Lumiere still stuck out. You know, Zimmer Boli has a lot of name. It's not as much of a name
Mm-hmm.
as Lumiere de Arage. I will say that Lumiere de
Yeah.
Arage flows off the tongue brilliantly. I mean, it just is, it's beautiful sounding. It really is beautiful sounding. And there was something kind of cool about that name being assigned to this mech because we're talking about again like a death dealing machine, and you've got this elegant name of Lumiere de Arage. So I liked the
Mm-hmm.
juxtaposition there, but then that clearly was not. If I had made a decision to keep the name because of that, I would have been a bad localization editor. So it had to go. Uh, Caliban, sorry if I'm butchering your name. I oftentimes wonder if it's pronounced Caliban in the Discord as well. Forgive me. Said Japanese people use European names for sci-fi because they oftentimes sound cool and out of this world for Japan once they're in katakana. Yes, absolutely. Look at the German-derived
Mm-hmm.
names from Super Robot Wars OG. Yes, totally. That is very true. And so then, you're left with, as the localization company, with, all right, so that's why they chose this name for their language because it looked good in their language, but it doesn't look good in this language, which means it's time to do something about it. So this is why I love localization. There's nuance to it. There's real nuance, and there's a real need to understand the context in which a lot of these terms are used, and in this case, how the names were used. So let's talk about the last mech here. You want to pull up Garu?
Yeah.
The other, we're not going to go through all nine. We're just going to go through these five, but the other ones did not undergo such radical transformation. So talking about them isn't nearly as interesting, I don't think.
Here we go.
All right, so there's Garu. Um, Garu. So Garu, I call him Garu. He was originally Lu Garu or Lugaru. Lu spelled Lou space Garu. Um, so I mean, Tyler, I've taken first go at these. What was your first response when you saw the
I
name?
mean, yeah, I always thought it was Lugaru as well, but I was just about to say like this was one of the names that I always was kind of wondering like I don't know if I'm actually saying this one correctly or not.
Yeah, because I think there could be a case where someone would see that first name and say, Lao? Is it Lao? And then already you're then wondering with the
Yeah.
with the last name, it's like, was it Garao? Is it Garu? Is it Yeah, I mean, so we didn't necessarily escape completely the how do I pronounce this? Because Guru can be, that word can have a different inflection depending on where you put the inflection. You've got Garu or you've got Guru, which is, I mean, those are different names, I mean, they're spelled the
Mhm.
same, but they're pronounced differently. And so therefore people are going to see that particular mech in a certain way. So there is a little bit of that with this. But again, I wanted to maintain the essence of the original translation. So that's why I decided to drop the Lu part. So my first response when I saw Lu Guru was I saw that name Lu Guru, and I in my head, again, this is just talking you through the localization process. So I want to be as honest as I can. I saw that, and in my head, I immediately said, "Oh, that's my dude Lou," and I was like, "No, that's done. We're dropping it there. This cannot be my dude Lou. Um, like people are gonna call him Lou, and then inevitably you're gonna have someone who calls him Louie, and the next thing that we know, we're gonna be calling this mech Louie. Louie is a great name. I didn't want
True.
I didn't want Louis the name of my mech though. Again, I wanted these to feel like mechs, not someone you'd meet off the street. And so this kind of goes to that same problem that I talked about before of, I didn't want this to sound, I wanted these names to sound strong. I wanted them to sound like warrior names. I mean, that was a big part of this, is I wanted to ensure that these mechs felt like warriors. And just, that first part of Lu, I just felt like did not maintain that warrior spirit for this mech. Not to say that Lu can't be a warrior name. It totally can be. Don't get me wrong. But we're talking about mechs here, and for this game, it made more sense to drop the Lu part. So those were some of the issues that we ran into with localizing the names, and why we made the choices that we made. So we've already been talking for about 50 minutes, which is a lot longer than I was expecting. So we're only about halfway through. We're definitely not going to go another 90 minutes. I'm starting to see a trend here, folks. I'm starting to see that I talk, which is the essence of a show called LionWing Talks. Um, but nevertheless, sometimes these are getting a little long. I'm pulling back-to-back nights of 90-minute Twitch streams. I got a question in the chat here. Are you going to keep the full names in coherent English spelling as a subtext on the card? It may not be necessary, but it still adds some flavor. It's like those titles under Fantasy Hero cards. I'm not. I feel like you just explained yourself really well, and for some reason, my brain is broken right now, and I can't fully piece together what you're asking me, and I don't think it's of any fault of your own. Could you give that question to me one more time in a different way, please? It's been a long day, folks. I'm still recovering from being sick over the weekend, and I'm not back on the horse completely. I'll have to apologize. Sin also had a comment here. So this might have nothing to do with it, but there is a French creature called Rougarou, yes, which is a werewolf. Yes, no. That is that was clearly the inspiration for Garu or Guru. Because if you look at the mech, and we don't have him put up right now, but clearly he's meant to be a more wolf-like mech. That's his whole gimmick. That's his whole thing, and so that is where they pulled that name from. And at the same time, it still doesn't make for a good name when you are localizing into English. And so we got to keep part of that. We got to keep part of it, and I think we kept
Yeah.
the right part of it. But yes, I mean, it's not like, although sometimes it looked like the names were kind of slapdash efforts of just throwing things together. Clearly, that's not what happened. The folks at Mosaic, and most creators of any kind of work, regardless of your genre or medium or industry, put love and care and time into what they're creating. And so the names clearly were designed with a purpose behind them. And I don't want to imply otherwise. But again, when you take that and you translate it to another language, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should keep that name, even though there was clear thought that went behind it, because not everyone, this is a perfect example. Not everyone is going to know what Sin Theory just threw out there. That, that's the name for werewolf in French. Dare I say, most people would not know that. And so you have to do your part as the localizer to connect the game with people in the best way that you know how. And for a tabletop game, the way that you connect with your audience is through images and text. And you got to make sure both are on point. And as the localizer looking at the tech side of things, that was part of my job, was to make sure that the text was on point and that it resonated with folks and it didn't get in the way of them experiencing the game. Instead, it enhanced their experience, or at least it added to it, or at the very, very least, it did not get in the way. So, all right. So, we've still got that mech description, or the mech board. You want to throw up that mech board real quick again, Tyler? Sorry, you just pulled it down.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Is there any way you could zoom in on the top right corner where we give the flavor text beneath Garu's name?
Let me see if I can. Oh.
So in the top right corner of the mech boards in this game, which we call unit boards, I call them mech boards, but technically we call them unit boards
Ooh.
in the rulebook. There we go. Now
Oh.
we're zooming in. We're getting there.
No.
Um,
Oh.
yep. There we go. Use the trusty sliders when all else fails. So, um,
Yeah.
but
There we
below
go.
the names on the mech boards, the unit boards, is some flavor text. So the flavor text for the English version, we did not keep exactly as it was in the Japanese version. We took this opportunity to maintain the elements, sort of the essence of, that's what I meant, not elements, essence of what that flavor text was in the Japanese version. But we also wanted to do something a little bit different. So what we decided to do is most of our little taglines up there where you've got your flavor text are a combination of informative text and also then a bit more of like a flavor oriented narrative text beneath it. So uh, although for Garo, I think we just went with we're giving you exactly what this mech is about. So we decided when I was looking at these, thinking, all right, what do we do with these things? What do we do with this text here? Do we keep it? Do we drop it entirely? Because it's not like it's needed. Um, it's not giving you information that you wouldn't procure yourself by playing the game. But I ultimately decided, hold on a second, no, we're definitely going to keep that information up there. But what we are going to do instead is we are going to make it informative text so that when people are first playing the game, they can look at that text and know exactly what kind of mech that is. So the mech boards already are super overwhelming. And there's like so much text in this game that like it's already easy to get overwhelmed with this game, despite the fact that once you like grasp what the game is about, it's a very intuitive game. It's pretty simple. But sometimes first impressions are everything. First impressions are going to determine whether someone comes back to your game a second time. And obviously, we want people to come back to the game a second time and a third time and a fourth time and 100th time. And so, one of the ways to ensure that they come back for that 100th time, so to speak, is to make their first experience with the game as enjoyable as possible. So for us, because you've got 9 embryo machines to choose from, and on these mech boards are just a shit ton of information, I wanted to say, all right, if someone opens up this game for the first time, they see all these numbers, they have no idea what an evade value is or what haul means. I want them to know exactly what type of mech this is. So we're going to use that text area below their name to give players a quick snapshot of what this mech is about and the type of play style that this mech has. So can you go back to that screen real quick?
Yeah, I don't. It should still be there. I'm not sure why it keeps dropping it.
Yeah, that's all right.
Here, let me just give me one sec.
Yeah. So for Garu, he's Garu's a a bit of an aggressive character. I mean, I guess you could play any you you could play any mech in any way that you wanted to in Embryo Machine, depending on what you do for a deck. But pre-built right away, Garo is an aggressive mech, and so I wanted to make sure that we emphasize that in his flavor text, so that people who wanted sort of close range combat, the type of get out character, almost like Fornice is in some ways, though the two are very different. Let me tell you, how you execute upon Garu is very different than how you execute upon Fornice, despite the fact that they might have some overlapping similarities in the type of play that they offer. Garu, I wanted to emphasize that he's a master of short range combat. So I'll just read the text here. It says, a veritable master of short range combat and high damage weapons. Shredding armor is what Garu does best. So we got a little bit of flavor text at the bottom, but then we also tell you exactly what you're getting into if you choose Garu as your embryo machine. And again, as a first time player, that's the information you're looking for. It's one sentence, it's like a dozen words. You read it real quickly, and then you can move on to the next mech to figure out how they compare to this one. So that's our approach that we took with this flavor text up here. And I think it worked out. Again, we kept the essence of what was on the Japanese release. It's not like we radically changed this aspect, but we made it a little bit more focused. It didn't feel as concentrated in the Japanese release, which again probably worked totally perfectly for their audience. But for ours, we wanted to kind of tighten the screws a little bit, narrow the focus, and tell folks exactly what kind of mech they were looking at. So that's that. Um, All right, so let's talk about some graphic changes, and that'll be our last topic for the night. We might do another one of these in the future. I don't know, but graphic changes. So this is where Tyler is going to be able to offer a lot to the conversation because he was the person who was in charge of finding the right look for the game,
Mhm.
ensuring that the layouts were clean and that they made sense to the new players. If we needed to keep the layouts as they were, if we needed to make modifications to them. So Tyler, I'm not gonna just like hand things over to you because I don't I don't know if I even told you I'd be doing that tonight, so I won't do that to you. But when thinking just about the graphics on sort of a higher level, what came to mind to you? What came to mind for you, or what would you like folks to know about what it was like working on Embryo Machine as the graphic designer?
Yeah, so from the beginning, I spent a lot of time just looking at pretty much and all material I could get my hands on to kind of get a feel for, especially with like the Japanese characters. Matching a font was really important to me, of like trying to kind of imply the same kind of feel and look and aesthetic with how different the language is. You really have to pay attention to like the boldness of the fonts and like the strokes that they were kind of using, as well as just the color use. And I think overall it worked out really well. They had some cool kind of the logo, like the grittier text effects mixed with some like cleaner kind of military print. And I don't know. I think overall it turned out really well with what we were looking for. And also, luckily, with a lot of how the cards were laid out, as well as the mech sheets, there wasn't a lot of need to rearrange the content. The spaces were able to accommodate not only the original Japanese characters, but also the English as well, which was really nice.
Yeah, so
Um,
what really stuck out to me is in the early goings of this project. Tyler and I, this is not the first project that we've worked on. This is not the
right.
first LionWing project that we worked on. Tyler was the graphic designer on our first project, Cinema Coliseum,
Hmm.
and so we had the luxury of working together once before, and then now 3 years later, when I linked back up with Tyler, I said to him, a lot's changed in 3 years. Our process is a lot more streamlined these days. It's not as painful as it once was. I know what I'm doing now, that kind of thing. And so one of the first things I said to Tyler is I said, all right, what I want you to do is I want you to take a card and I want you to give me like three mock-ups. They can look similar, they
Hmm.
can look different. I prefer if they all looked kind of different. And I want you to use different texts or a different font. I want you to use different font sizes. I want you to use different effects. Whatever you want to do, I want you to present a card to me in three different ways so that we can begin to focus on what we like most, and then we can kind of narrow things down and we can drill down on certain aspects that we really like, and then we can leave other aspects that we don't like to the side. And so that gave us a starting point of like, just come up with three things and let's go from there. And this was one of those rare instances, Tyler, where you came back and my idea for like saying, hey, give me three, and then we're going to use some of those as a template to build, and then we're going to like build off of that. But this is one of those rare times that Tyler presented three things, and one of them in the three was the one that we ended up using.
It
And it
was
was,
cool. Yeah,
yeah, it was this look of a very kind of utilitarian. He called it like a military look, but I think of it as a utilitarian look of where
totally.
he one of the templates was kind of like this very very clean, very sharp, not flashy but not boring look to the cards, to the font, to the sizing of the font, to the different font in the sidebar as opposed to the font that's being used in the description boxes. I'm going to pull up a card here. Actually, can you pull up can you share your screen on the shield card?
Yeah.
That way we've got something to show folks here. There we go. All right. So Um, so this is one of our add-on type cards, which acts as sort of like a passive ability, and Embryo Machine add-ons do. But this, what you're looking at right now, with the size of the fonts that were used, the stroke of the fonts in some cases, like on the title of the card. This was
Hmm.
one of the ones basically that Tyler presented me with, and I loved it so much because it is clean. Tyler, how did you merge these different graphical elements together with different fonts and the effects of the fonts and all of that?
Well, yeah, that's actually a really interesting question because I really, from the get go, I really wanted to try to stick to the original look and feel as much as possible. That was something that really drew me to the game in the first place when you first presented it to me. And so, really, I stuck with. I mean, like the shading on the title for the shield is the exact same from the Japanese version. And then from there, it was just mainly just identifying those fonts, which it's all the same kind of family, and it all just kind of bled together that way perfectly. And it was the closest thing I could find to those original characters and stylings.
Yeah, so I'm gonna pull up something on my end here. Um, I'm gonna show you all the Japanese the Japanese version of this card. Give me a second. I wasn't planning on sharing this particular window, but give me a second. Let's do a window
Okay.
capture. Yeah, here we go. All right. So, sorry, this is not going to look clean on the screen because I'm doing this all in real time. I'm adjusting the screen size, all that good stuff. So, making for great video, let me tell you. Um, Here we go.
I do. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you're looking at the same card, one in English, one in Japanese, and as Tyler said, uh, he and I really wanted to maintain the look, the feel, the aura of the original cards because Kosaic did such a great job in conveying a feeling just through the text that they decided to use and through the layout and all of that, of course. But just
Mhm.
talking about text right now, font and all that, they did such a great job with that. It's not like we knew better than the designers about their game. You know, I mentioned that in last night's stream. Like we don't know the game better than the designers, and the designers chose this look very intentionally. And so it was awesome for Tyler to say, you know what, I'm going to replicate that, and I'm going to give that to you as one of the options here in the beginning to get us started. And then ultimately, we're like, yeah, no, that's the option.
It
There
worked
are
out the
no other
best.
options, right?
Yeah, yeah. Fun fact too is the actual content text is actually the same original font. It just supported Japanese characters as well as English. So I kind of use that as like the backbone inspiration for the rest of the fonts as well.
Which is the first time we have ever done that in any project before. Which is cool. I mean, to be able to do that, I mean, talk about there being no other way, no better way to maintain the vibe of something than using the same text. I mean, now
Hmm.
sometimes you'll do that, and when you see English lettering in that font
Yeah.
style, you're like, yeah, no, that doesn't work.
This is just the first time it worked out. Yeah, where it actually looked cool.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we kind of got lucky in that regard where it did look cool. So not only did it look good, but we were able to maintain the style and the feel because of it. I mean, it doesn't get
Yeah.
much better than that. It also doesn't get much easier than that, right?
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, it does kind of help keep things simple. But I also feel like it was just like the truest form of the original material as well, which to me really was exciting.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I want to pull up something else here.
Mhm.
This doesn't necessarily talk about like graphics or layout or whatever, but I did want to show, you know, in the editing process. I mean, you have a lot of steps in the editing process. You know,
Mhm.
I can't even begin to tell you how many passes you do in localization on, you know, on your text, and you know, tabletop games are no different. The localization process is no different. So what we're looking at here is an earlier pass on the same card, and if you look at Tyler's screen, we've got what is our current version of the card. So as you'll see here, we've got some changes to the text that we decided to make. And I think this is a cool thing to see for folks who are not necessarily doing localization work, but it's a cool look at like how this process happens, what the editing process happens, how cards evolve over time as you continue to look at them more, do more passes, get the cards in front of more people who then give you feedback on the cards to say, hey, maybe you want to, you know, tighten up this wording or tweak this wording or whatever the case may be. So I want to read these descriptions to you. Now, this is not a huge change in text, but it's an intentional change in text, and it's a very clarifying change in text. Now, there are some cards that we won't show off tonight necessarily because we don't have them prepared that underwent radical transformations. So this isn't one of those cards, but it still illustrates the point of how things change when you're going through the editing process. So our our previous card, our previous iteration of shield, the description said, may be destroyed from your hand to reduce shooting damage by 4. When plotted, may be revealed and destroyed at any time to reduce any damage by 4. All right. Here's our new text. May be destroyed from your hand to reduce shooting damage by 4. When plotted, may be revealed and destroyed at any time to reduce shooting and combat damage by 4. So, what the change here is more specificity. Anytime that you can eliminate there being a misinterpretation of a rule, a misinterpretation of how damage is allocated, how damage is done, what type of damage is done. Anytime that you can mitigate those things through a sort of a laser focused bit of editing, the better job you're doing as a publisher to ensure that you're putting in front of your customers who are paying their hard-earned money for your works, you're putting in front of them a good product. And so when you look at these side by side, you think, well, those things basically say the same thing. And yes, that's part of the editing process is you're tweaking things to get it, to get the wording just right. But the new version gets it closer. It gets it more right. And it leaves less room for error. And it really comes in the last couple, words of that sentence there. In the past, it says, or in the previous iteration, it says to reduce any damage by 4. In the current version, you've got to reduce shooting or combat damage by 4. There are many types of damage in the game, and certainly shooting and combat damage are the two primary damages. But you might think that damage from something else entirely, well, okay, how does shield then apply to that? And then suddenly you've got people confused. People stopped playing the game. They are then furiously looking through your rulebook to try to figure out what this means, or they're going online, they're going to the BGG forums to figure out if anyone else has come up against this problem. They're going to your website to see if you have an FAQ. They're looking on YouTube to see a playthrough and hoping that someone encounters the same exact scenario so you can see how they handle the scenario. I mean, you've totally broken down the flow of your game. People aren't playing your game anymore. They're reading about your game. They're trying to figure out your game. They're not playing it. And so this is one of those edits that I felt was perfect to show because it helps players stay engaged because it leaves less room for misinterpretation and error. So I really wanted to show this because this is what happens in publishing. This is what happens in our industry. I mean, it happens in any industry where there's text, right? It could be books that we're talking about. The same thing happens there too. But I only know my industry. I only know this industry. And so in this industry, these are the problems that we come up against. But this is also the stuff that like excites the hell out of me. I love going over text, and I was not the main editor on Embryo Machine. I rarely am the main editor on any of our games. Gun and Gun was the only time that I was close to being the main editor. Usually I'm sort of the backup editor or I'm a proofreader. And I let someone who's a true, a real sort of professional editor take care of things. Gun and Gun was different because I love competitive card games. And so I felt very well versed in competitive card games to edit that rule book. But outside of that, I usually bring on, and it's usually the same person. It's usually Eli. And so this was one of those instances where, Eli went through several revisions and he and I talked about what these revisions should be. And he and I stay in close contact throughout the entire editing process because he's asking questions about the original Japanese that he can't necessarily answer because he doesn't speak Japanese. And so we try to maintain communication throughout the entire process. And this was one of those times where we both agreed, like, all right, yeah, we can shore up that language some. We can make it more clear. And hopefully that means that there's less confusion. If there's any confusion in this card, I don't think there's any confusion left in this card. In the previous iteration that you're looking at on the left side of the screen, there was confusion there. There could be confusion there, but not anymore. So that is that. Probably take away that window. Bit of an eyesore there. Uh, Tyler, is there anything that you wanted to share with folks that we haven't discussed thus far, especially as it pertains to the graphics changes that we made?
Um, no, I think we kind of covered everything I wanted to kind of talk about, which, I mean, for me, the most part was just trying to stay as true to the original material as possible.
Yeah, I think the probably the biggest change is we didn't change any of the card layouts themselves, which was like
Mm-mm.
oftentimes that happens in localization, is you just have to because
Yeah,
the language of Japanese is clearly very different than English, and so sometimes
mm,
that means reworking a layout so that it makes more sense with the new English text. But this is one of those cases
absolutely.
where we didn't have to change the layout of the cards. We didn't have to change the layout of the mechs. Now, I will say that we did some alterations to the mech boards to make the mech boards more clear about what they were, and that specifically
Mhm.
pertains to the usage of the terms size and armor class. We made
That
those.
is true.
Yeah, I forgot about that when we were going through those before. We made that more clear in the
Mhm.
English version. It wasn't as clear in the Japanese version, or at least when the Japanese was translated, it just left some room for interpretation, and I didn't like that. I remember having a conversation with you, Tyler, about that. But the cards
Yeah.
themselves, yeah, we didn't do a lot of changes to. Go ahead, you were gonna say something.
Oh no, I mean, I was just gonna say that the size and armor class fields just didn't weren't labeled like the rest of them for whatever reason,
Yeah,
but we
were
added that in.
were they labeled at all?
No, they were not. They kind of, I mean, they're slightly different since the size is an asset. I think they're kind of implied to be more just like you know what that means. But since everything else was labeled, we decided to go ahead and label them, which I think makes it. I think it adds like a nice feel to the card.
Yeah, no, I forgot they weren't labeled at all. It was just like the lettering that was there, and it was random. It was like, what does LL mean? Like I have no, I have
Yeah,
I don't know what this means. I have no, I have no
that's
text to
that's
tell
why I
me what
reached
this
out
could
to you.
possibly mean. Um,
Yeah, I mean that's why I reached out. I was like, I don't know what that means or what is that. Like I don't know what
That's
this
right.
is.
That's what ultimately sparked the conversation. Is you were going through the and you're like, "Hey,
Yeah,
just so that I know, like, what does this stuff mean?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, if the
yeah.
graphic designer of the game is asking this question, players are going to ask this question.
I
We
mean, I
need
hadn't gotten to the rule book yet, but yeah, I mean, it was one of those things where I just was like, I don't know what this is.
Yeah, no. I mean, it is mentioned in the rule book, but again, I don't know about you. Sometimes
Yeah,
I open up a game and I just kind of want to like piece together things as much as possible by myself without reading a rule book. Okay, so like full
totally.
disclosure, I hate reading rule books. I've mentioned in some of our updates that I like to just watch tutorials, and now I'm telling you that sometimes I just flip haphazardly through assets and hope that I can understand the game by looking at the assets. I hate rule books. Um, I
It's where
just
I start too.
yeah,
Yeah.
I just don't have the attention span for them. So this is one of those things that really would have helped me. I open up the mech boards and I'm like, I have no idea what that is because I wouldn't have read the rule book yet.
hmm
But
Yeah, and I feel like if you're looking at the card trying to decide what you want to what you wouldn't have, I feel like out of all like those are important factors to keep in mind as you kind of pick. Like I'll be looking at the name, the description, what's its size, what's its armor class, you know, how many slots does it have? Like it's all important information to have. So
for sure, and
you should make it as clear as possible.
a change that we also made in that regard is I think in the Japanese version, I wish I could just open the box right behind me, but then all my games would come towering forward. They're all set up particularly well. But I think also for armor class and size in the Japanese version, they both just used single letters, right? So it would be like the
Yeah.
size would be like S, but then the armor class, which was meant to say like a medium armor class, would just be an M. And it's like,
Yeah.
what? Which is the size? Which is the armor class? Does M mean medium? Does small mean because I don't even know what this letter is pertaining to, what could this S possibly mean here? Um,
Yeah.
so again, if you read the rule book, it makes perfect sense. But when you're just looking at it, it's like, oh boy, what is happening right now? I forgot. I'm glad that came up. That was
Totally agree.
a fun little change. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that was that was some of our thoughts and experiences with the Embryo Machine localization. It was it's been a fun project. I mean, we still have work to do. Obviously, we're not done with
hmm
doing our passes. We'll continue to tighten things up. Our ship date isn't until December, so we've got a little bit of time that we specifically gave ourselves a little bit of a bigger window with this project than in our previous projects. A, because of the stretch goals and how involved those are, but also just because there's so much more happening in this game than in a lot of our previous games, that we wanted to make sure that we got everything just right. Again, with any kind of competitive game, if you miss something or if something's off, you can effectively break the entire experience, and we didn't want that to happen. So we'll still be going
Yeah.
through and tightening the screws on some things and changing other things. And what you're looking at on the campaign page, what you've looked at tonight, might not be what is reflected in the final version. That's all pretty standard stuff. But by and large, this has been a fun project. What have you enjoyed this project, Tyler?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun to work on, and actually, it's been great.
Yeah. So, and Kosaic has been fantastic along the way. They've answered all my questions and have just really given
Hmm.
us good guidance and given us insight into why they made certain choices that they made,
They
which
have
helped
been
us
awesome.
make our decisions of, okay, well, then let's make sure that we maintain that in our version too. And also, there have been times when they've given us feedback and we're like, okay, yeah, so we can change that or we can take that out entirely because it's not necessary. It's not necessary. I don't know if we necessarily subtracted anything outright from the English version of Embryo, but still, being in close communication with them has been really helpful, and they've been fantastic. I can't say enough great things about Kazaic. So, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This was supposed to be like a 30-minute presentation. Lo and behold, it seems like 90 minutes is my sweet spot. So, I appreciate you hanging in there with us, asking questions, engaging in the chat as always. We'll be back next week for a normal episode of LionWing Talks next Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where I'll be answering your questions. And until then, keep an eye on the campaign page. I'm going to be posting an update tonight, so be on the lookout for that. Thank you everyone for joining us. Tyler, thank you, sir, for joining me, and of course for all your work on Embryo Machine.
Absolutely, man. Thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
All right, folks. Until next time, take care.